Drosophila melanogaster is a species of fly in the family Drosophilidae. The species is often referred to as the fruit fly, or lesser fruit fly, or less commonly as the vinegar fly or pomace fly. But just because something's small doesn't mean you should think less of it, and a vinegar fly might help you just in time. And when all else fails, just remember, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. My name's Brad, and my family owns a cabin in Colorado that we use for skiing. When this story takes place, I was 21, and my two brothers were still in high school. My parents used to take us on trips there every season, though the last time we all went as a family was years ago. Currently, I was the only one who used the cabin. This particular trip was the first of the season, and incidentally, I was the last person to use the cabin during the previous season. I drove in on a Tuesday evening, and when I got there, it was snowing. I walked around the outside to inspect for damage. Several trees hung over the roof, but luckily it didn't seem like any branches had fallen and caused damage. So I stepped inside. Our cabin was rather spacious and included a kitchen, family room, 2 bedrooms, and a utility room, which housed the washer, dryer, and furnace. Nothing immediately seemed out of place. However, when I went to turn on the furnace, I thought I could smell something. At first I thought it was the furnace, but it smelled more like rotting fruit. The odor was very faint, so I wasn't even sure that's what it was. But then I noticed something. A tiny speck of black moved around in the air before landing on top of the washing machine. I moved in closer and realized what it was. It was a fruit fly. That immediately struck me as odd. I'm not saying I've never seen them before, but there was absolutely no reason for a fruit fly to be there. I always make a point to check and clean the cabin each time I leave, especially since our parents sometimes allow friends or extended family to use our cabin. It also didn't make sense because, well, what had it been eating? Even if some piece of fruit got wedged somewhere, could it really have survived for months? I honestly didn't know the answer to that question, so I looked things up on my phone. Apparently the average fruit fly can live between 40 and 50 days, but can only live a week without food. Therefore, there had to be food somewhere in the cabin, or else it had to be removed within the last week. This is where I started to entertain the idea of a break-in, and then made the connection that someone might have been living in the cabin. However, at that point, that possibility didn't seem likely, as both the front and back doors had been locked and nothing outside or inside the cabin seemed out of place, aside from the smell and the fruit flies. I got my flashlight and shined it as best I could around the furnace, and then checked under the washing machine and dryer, but I couldn't find anything. If there was an old piece of fruit there, I had no idea where it was. I walked back through the rest of the house, checking inside of every nook and cranny, but there wasn't anything there. I debated about contacting my parents and brothers, partly because I didn't want to scare them if this really was a false alarm, but I went ahead anyway. They each confirmed that I had been the last one in the cabin, and additionally, my parents seemed very concerned. I told them that I had checked everywhere but couldn't find anything, and both doors had been locked when I got there. I asked them if there were any hidden closets or crawl spaces I wasn't aware of. My parents told me there weren't as far as they knew. I finished bringing the rest of my stuff in from my car. By now it was a bit late to hit the slopes, so I figured I'd just stay inside and have dinner while watching something on the TV we had there. I'd brought a few items, but settled on a TV dinner with meatloaf. I also had some beef jerky and root beer, which completed the meal. As I sat there on the couch, I couldn't help going over different possibilities in my mind. Was one of my brothers pranking me? Was this all some kind of joke that the rest of my family was in on? Did one of our friends or relatives secretly use the cabin and make a duplicate of the key we'd given them? I honestly couldn't tell, but there didn't seem much I could do to figure things out now. Still, I was moderately paranoid, so I kept the TV turned down low and I sat there and watched this movie about a group of people living on the secret beach. I honestly can't remember the name. I managed to get into it, but 30 minutes later I heard a clicking sound. I muted the TV. At first I thought the noise was coming from the furnace, as there weren't any other appliances running besides the TV, but the sound seemed very deliberate. Then it hit me. It was the sound of a key being turned in a lock. I ran to the back door and almost died when I realized the handle was being turned. I grabbed the handle to stop it, and it seemed like whoever was on the other side of the door stopped immediately when they realized I was holding it. Everything from this point on felt completely surreal. I locked the door and braced it with a chair as I ran to get one of my hunting knives. While the back door didn't have windows, every room except for the utility room had them, so I figured that whoever was at the back door knew someone was home before trying to open it. However, I still turned the TV completely off and turned off all the lights. I crouched down behind the couch, out of view of the windows, trying to listen and collect my thoughts. Eventually I stuck my head up above the couch and looked around. The blinds and drapes were all closed, but then I saw it. I saw the silhouette of a man standing right in front of the living room window. There's no way he could have noticed me, but a second after I saw him, he started screaming and banging manically on the windows. I screamed too and ran to the front door, which was on the other side of the cabin. I got in my truck and floored it back to the road. When I got to the town center, I called 911 and reported a break-in. 20 minutes later, the cops arrived at my location, and we went back to the cabin together. The police announced their presence before entering and searched the whole cabin. A few of the food items, including my dinner, had been stolen, but everything else, including the TV, looked like it hadn't been touched. I told the cops to do a thorough check by the furnace, where I thought old food might have been located, but they couldn't find anything there either. When I called my parents, my mom was hysterical and ordered me to go home immediately. That was what I was planning to do anyway. My parents and I questioned my two brothers, who swore up and down that they hadn't been there since I left the previous time, and hadn't lost any of the keys they had been given. Next, my parents contacted our friends and relatives who had stayed at the cabin before, which was less than 10 people, most of whom hadn't been to the cabin in years. No one could remember losing a key or anything else suspicious happening. Ultimately, the police never caught that man, nor figured out who he was. Based on the fact that he only stole food and had likely been living in the cabin at some point, my theory is that he was just homeless and needed a place to stay and food to eat. Two things still bother me though. Why did he just start banging on the windows like that? And where did he get that key? One other thought goes through my mind as well. How might things have gone differently if I hadn't noticed that fruit fly? I'm a graduate student at a health science center, and though my work has largely been tedious, there is one thing that happened that made me feel like James Bond. I know that sounds ridiculous, and it actually is, but just wait. To avoid trouble, I won't mention where I do research or other specifics, but I will say that I work with fruit flies. Most people don't know that fruit flies, or Drosophila melanogaster, are widely used in genetic research. They've actually been used for over a century. Fruit flies are usually stored in plastic test tubes that have food at the bottom, and in total, our lab probably has around 500 tubes with flies in it at any given time. Sometimes we exchange flies with other labs, and use expedited shipping to send and receive the flies. One time about a year ago, we were expecting a delivery of flies, which would be sent to one of the offices in another building. For some reason they didn't ship it directly to the lab, I'm not sure why. Coincidentally, there was also a 4-day-long conference going on in another city, and the rest of the researchers in the lab went there. There weren't any techs or any other workers in the lab at that time, so what it boiled down to was that I needed to stop by this office each day to check if the package had arrived. The second day after everyone had left for the conference, I started walking to the building with the office after finishing up what I needed to at the lab. There were several buildings in the science center with a nice little courtyard between them. And though they were connected underground, I enjoyed walking through the courtyard and getting some air. This was probably around 3 in the afternoon, and the sky was overcast and it was just starting to rain, which I thought made for some excellent ambiance. However, as I was about halfway through the courtyard, I noticed something. I saw a large black object behind one of the benches further away from me. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person or just some piece of equipment, but if it was a person, then they seemed to be deliberately crouching down. I was curious, but decided not to investigate. When I reached the doors to the building, I looked back and saw that that object was still there. I figured it was just a piece of equipment. Sometimes the center held special events, probably for people who donated money, and they'd usually set up a stage, food area, and tents. Therefore, I wasn't really sketched out. This building and the courtyard were pretty empty at this time of day. and when I took the stairs to this office on the 3rd floor, I didn't see anyone. I did see that a package had arrived, and I opened it just a bit to make sure it had the test tubes of flies in there. They were there, complete with food in the bottoms and white stoppers in the tops. I walked back down the stairs, still without seeing anybody, and then walked back into the courtyard. As that same bench came into view, I instinctively looked over to it, and I was surprised to see that the object was no longer there. I guess it had been a person. I kept walking until I was almost to the other side of the courtyard, when I stopped. There, about 30 feet away, was a black object behind another bench. Now I was sketched out, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Soon after I spotted the bench, a man stood up. He was wearing a black trench coat and a black beanie, and right away I knew his intentions weren't good. I was frozen, and the man started walking over to me. The first thing he said was, "Nice afternoon." I didn't say anything, and the man probably knew I was scared senseless. He walked a bit closer and asked, "Do you work here?" I managed to nod my head. That's when I realized he was holding onto something in his pocket. My blood ran cold, and my entire existence seemed to shrink to a single point. The man stepped closer until he was only like 15 feet away. "What's in the box?" he said. To this day, I don't know how I pulled what I pulled out of my mind. I looked the man in the eye and said, "Nitroglycerin." I opened the package and pulled out the top of one of the tubes, just far enough to show the white stopper. Of course, no one would transport nitroglycerin that way, but judging from the man's eyes getting wider, he believed me. We stood there looking at each other for what seemed like 10 minutes, though it was only like 10 seconds. Without saying a word, he turned and started walking away. My heart was pounding as I started walking away myself. I felt like sprinting, but I wanted to keep up the appearance that I had a weapon and could defend myself. I can't tell you how wonderful it felt to badge into one of the doors on the other building and pull it shut behind me. At that point, I ran up a flight of stairs and dialed 911. I was still on edge, waiting to hear a door or window break downstairs, and planning to run to another set of stairs if that happened. There was no one in this part of the building either. 5 minutes later, I heard police announcing their presence from downstairs, and it was music to my ears. I opened the door to let them in, and they immediately delivered good news. They had apprehended the man, who apparently had still been in the immediate vicinity. That was the end of my nightmare. When I told my fellow graduate students and lab members what happened, they were shocked at what happened, but also in awe of how I handled things. We even had a bit of a celebration when my lab returned. I still think about what happened fairly often, I'd say, as it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I'm just grateful I wasn't harmed. Even though going to get the package was what led to the encounter with that man, I'm still thankful for those fruit flies in their test tubes, and how that helped me bluff the man and escape. Three years ago, I had the most horrific experience of my life. Part of what makes this terrifying is how close I came to being kidnapped, and how I barely managed to escape. I was set up on a blind date by one of my friends, Michelle. We'd recently graduated college, but Michelle still liked to go out every weekend and usually got pretty hammered. I'd go with her occasionally, though that wasn't really my scene anymore. I'd only dated off and on up to that point in my life, and one day Michelle made it her mission to help me get a long-term boyfriend. She told me she knew the perfect guy, and though I suspected he was just someone she met while drinking, I decided to go along with it. So there I was, waiting at a random bar on a Friday night. My date showed up a few minutes later and introduced himself as Dan. Like me, he was in his mid-20s, and overall I'd say he was rather average looking. I sat back down at the little table, and Dan and I started to make small talk. Dan told me he was a graphic designer and worked nearby, and I told him I was a receptionist. Now, I don't consider myself to have unreasonably high standards, but there was just something off about Dan. And I noticed that immediately. For one thing, he was making excessive eye contact, almost to the point of staring at me. For another, every so often he'd just pause while saying something and smile. As the dinner went on, it came off as more and more creepy, to the point where I almost made an excuse to get up and leave. I'm honestly not even sure why I didn't do that. When we got our check, Dan paid it, which for some reason I hadn't expected him to do. I was also expecting him to try to keep this date going, but he didn't do that either. Instead, he told me he had a nice time, got up, and walked away. I just sat there, relieved, but also a bit confused. It was like 11, and I didn't feel like going anywhere else, so we walked back outside and got in my car. I looked around, half expecting to see Dan for some reason, but I didn't. I drove back to my apartment and eventually fell asleep. Now here's where things went from strange to bizarre and concerning. The next day I woke up and checked my phone, and I noticed there were a few texts from Michelle. I was immediately confused. Michelle seemed to be congratulating me for hitting it off with Dan yesterday. I responded and told her that Dan left after dinner, and we didn't even exchange phone numbers. Michelle responded with a question mark and then called me. She told me that Dan had texted her last night after our date ended and thanked her for setting us up. He even suggested that the three of us go out for drinks sometime. I couldn't believe what Michelle was telling me, to the point I started to suspect this was all a prank. I bluntly asked her if that's what this was, but she was adamant that it wasn't. Then I asked Michelle how she knew Dan, and after hesitating a bit, she told me they had met when a group of our friends went out drinking last week. Obviously, I didn't go with them. Next, I asked Michelle if she knew anything about Dan, but she said she didn't. Then Michelle told me something that made my blood run cold. She told me that she gave Dan my address. I almost slammed the phone down and started yelling at Michelle why she would do that. She started to apologize and told me that Dan wanted to send me a surprise gift, but didn't know where I lived. I knew Michelle had been drunk, and Dan simply took advantage of the situation. To what end, though, I didn't know. I asked Michelle if she had told Dan anything else, and she swore it was just that. I now had a decision to make. Did I want to confront Dan? Neither me nor Michelle had actually given him my phone number, so I could text or call him from her phone. Or did I just want to wait for Dan to bring this so-called gift, and then either not answer him or throw the gift away if he left it? I decided to opt for the latter, and I made Michelle promise not to return any texts or calls that Dan sent her. I can't tell you how paranoid I was after this. Leaving for work each day and getting back home turned into an exercise in anxiety. Even at night, I half expected to hear the buzzer letting me know Dan was downstairs. A week went by, and I started to relax and think it wouldn't happen. But then it did. It was 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and I was just watching TV when I heard it. My blood ran cold. I had already decided I was not going to answer it. I turned off the TV and lights and made sure the blinds and drapes were closed. Then I just sat there in the dark. A few minutes passed and then it buzzed again. I still sat there. 10 minutes passed, but then it buzzed again. At this point, I had resolved that if I heard the buzzer again, I would answer it aggressively and tell whoever it was to F off. I was mentally preparing myself for this encounter, but then it didn't buzz again. I kept sitting there for like half an hour, wondering if I should go downstairs and check by the front of the building. I decided I had to know, so I cautiously opened the door of my apartment and stepped outside. I honestly didn't expect Dan to have somehow gotten inside, nor was I entirely sure that that had been Dan, but given the situation, my paranoia was running extremely high. Our apartment complex was older and pretty small, and we didn't have anything like Ring, so the only way I could see if something had been left on the front porch was to physically walk outside. My apartment was on the second floor, and when I walked downstairs, I didn't see any of the other tenants, which didn't surprise me. But just as I was about 10 feet away from the doors, I stopped. I saw a few specks of black floating around. At first I thought they were mosquitoes, but then I figured they were gnats or fruit flies. Now, our building wasn't the cleanest, but people didn't usually leave food in the lobby, and there hadn't been anything there when I walked inside a few hours ago. I'm not sure why I made the connection that this could somehow be due to Dan, but again, given the situation, I was suspicious. Did he really leave something inside? And if so, did he really go back outside and buzz my apartment? My blood ran cold as I started to entertain the possibility that Dan was somewhere in this building with me. I did a quick check on my surroundings and didn't see him, though there were things like pillars and trash cans he could be hiding behind. I inched closer to see where the flies could be coming from. I saw a fruit basket. Now I was even more sure it had been Dan. I was wondering why he would have just left it in the lobby when I heard footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around and didn't see anyone, but I knew that sound had come from a person. I thought about my options, but didn't want to physically confront Dan if I didn't have to. Instead, I ran to the door. Just when I started to push it open, I heard running from behind me. I felt an arm wrap around my chest. I screamed through the door before I felt another arm wrap around me, and I was pulled back into the lobby. I kept screaming as I struggled and turned my head around. The person was wearing a mask, but I knew it was Dan. He put his hand over my mouth and muffled my screams, and though I kept trying to punch and scream, I couldn't get away. Then I heard tapping and then banging on the front doors, and a second later the glass from one of the windows shattered. A voice shouted, "Let her go," as a man started making his way through the broken window. Dan paused for a moment before letting go and running towards the man. There was a scuffle, but Dan managed to push his way through the door and get away. The stranger came back and asked if I was alright, and a moment later I heard knocking on the door. Apparently this man had been out drinking with his friends and ran over when he heard me screaming. He wasn't able to unlock the door since he didn't live there, but thank God that didn't stop him from breaking one of the windows. I'll never be able to express my gratitude to that man. We called the cops and they showed up several minutes later. One of them took a statement and stayed with me as the others checked the building. Even though Dan had left through the front door, he apparently made it completely away. Despite asking neighboring apartments and businesses for surveillance footage, they couldn't find him on there, and despite me working with the sketch artists, they never found him. The police also contacted everyone else in my apartment building, but no one said they recognized him nor given him the door code. I assume he had watched someone else putting it in. Our apartment building obviously changed the door code, and the cops watched the place and patrolled our area for a while after that. I also started carrying pepper spray. However, I knew I'd always be uneasy living there. I moved a few weeks later after finding another apartment, which I made sure had doorbell cameras and a surveillance system. Michelle and I had a falling out after this incident, and I haven't contacted her since. I'd be lying if I said I'm still not a bit fearful that I'll run into Dan again, but thankfully that hasn't happened yet. Even after all this, I'm still not sure exactly what his plan had been. I guess he buzzed the door, but then came inside and put down the fruit basket, hoping I'd walk to the door but get distracted just long enough so he could grab me? Why he set everything up by asking for a blind date with some random person and then asking for her address will always be beyond me. But another weird thought I have is, what if I hadn't noticed the fruit flies?